remember the Gender Recognition Act consultation? I know that's a pretty dull sentence to start with, but this was actually a topic I discussed when I very first started my channel more than 2.5 years ago at this point. The plan was to take advice from the LGBTQIA++ community and other interested parties into seeing whether any changes were needed to the Act, which dates all the way back from 2004. The response rate from the trans community in particular was around 70%, thanks in no part to pushing from the likes of Stonewall, who have taken a real vested interest in the trans movement since around 2015. Now, after a long consultation period, it turns out the government is going to do nothing. Yeah, that's according to various reports which have come out, meaning the Conservatives won't be adopting the self-ID provisions called for by many trans activists and their respected interest groups, at least from what we can see. Now, in effect, this means that everything should be staying the same. But that's not the reaction we're really seeing from the so-called queer community. Celebrities, news outlets, and even political parties have openly condemned the government for announcing things before they've announced what they are. And why is this? Why are they getting so angry? Well, it all relates to a Times article from more than a week ago on the 14th of June, where the term safeguards are mentioned in these leaked proposals, which might be put in place, including one sentence stating, new national guidelines on lavatory provisions are likely to be introduced, replacing the free-for-all in which councils set their own rules, which has seen a rise in gender-neutral lavatories. Now, this has been interpreted as a US-style bathroom law to be implemented in the UK. Now, speaking from my own experience, I find it quite hard to believe that something like this would actually happen, especially when you've got the government effectively moving from a all genders are valid position to one where they would effectively need to have people standing guard outside of bathrooms. Either way, I think this is quite an illiberal position. It shouldn't really be the government's place to mandate what private businesses or institutions should be doing with their bathrooms. That kind of decision should always be left to the property and not the government. But there's been very little skepticism about these claims, bearing in mind they're just coming from The Times. This is the only place where it's really quoted. And since then, everyone has taken this to be complete gospel, believing that this is something which is absolutely going to be coming in. Take, for example, this article from The Independent, which ran last week. Make no mistake, the government is mandating state-sponsored violence against trans people. Now, that's quite an alarmist statement to make, considering the only thing that's really happened is a rumoured proposal to monitor bathrooms, which is likely to not happen anyway. Just to give a little bit of context to the author, they were offended by Peter Hitchens because Hitchens did not want to misgender them in one of his articles. That's just to give an idea of the kind of person who believes that the state is now mandating violence against trans people. Now, straight away, the article really jumps into absurd levels of panic. For example, when you ask people to live for 2 years as their acquired gender without legal recognition, you require them to expose themselves to violence and discrimination without any real legal protection. Now, no stats are ever given to back up this claim, but it's quite a weird one to make. The gender recognition certificate really is only needed in very exceptional circumstances anyway. If you're going to be using a bathroom or a changing room or going about your daily business, even applying for jobs, it's actually illegal to request that document to be handed over. So I don't understand why not having that certificate is going to be instilling more discrimination against trans people. Like, anyone who has a GRC can tell you it's never once been demanded. But then it goes on, if you mandate that people with male genitalia, in commas, we all know what male genitalia is, love, are not allowed in women's spaces, you set an incredibly dangerous precedent for state-sponsored violence on trans women and trans people more widely. That's interesting. You tell the general public in no uncertain terms that it is their legal right to act as judge, jury, and executioner. And I don't use the word executioner lightly. Society is quite literally killing us. Trans women, and in particular, black trans women and trans women of colour, are being attacked and murdered for being trans. And that's not all. 48% of trans people have attempted suicide, and 84% have thought about it. We are being killed and are killing ourselves, and our blood is on the government's hands. Now, just for context again, this author is non-binary and is a assigned female at birth non-binary person at that. So bringing up all the trans women stuff to try and look like more of a victim is a little bit funny on me, but let's bring up a particular graphic, one which I've used in the past, and I'm getting bored of talking about this kind of statistic, but I need to in this situation. So look at this graphic of the deaths from trans people, or the murders of trans people around the world over between September 2018 and September 2019. Look at how it's all spread out. And again, the vast majority of which are deaths in South America. And for the vast majority of them, we don't actually know the context as to why they were murdered. So we do not know if it was transphobia related. But let's have a look at the British figure, because after all, this is an article about the UK. She's talking about the British government mandating state-sponsored violence. So I'm sure we're going to see a high figure there, except it's one. It's one person, and just to kind of clarify, this was a white trans woman, not a trans woman of colour, but a white trans woman who was murdered in her home. She was aged around her early 50s. The year before, there was one trans murder again. This time this was actually a trans woman of colour, and she was killed in a hotel room. Both of which are tragic deaths. Don't get me wrong, because I know someone will try to, but that doesn't quite scream pandemic of violence against trans people, does it? And if you look at the years prior, there hasn't been a murder of a trans woman in the UK, and I say trans woman because it's always trans women in these statistics, as much as MBs like to pretend it isn't, but it's always trans women, that there's been none since around 2013 or 2014. So there's the idea that we are living in this dangerous society doesn't quite wash. And of course, the favoured suicide statistic is wheeled out. And this is quite a tricky one to really address. And I know that people will probably try and take me a little bit out of context again, just to kind of explain my position on this. I've battled with suicidal thoughts in the past, and with depression, with anxiety. I've been very open about this, and I did attempt suicide about 10 years ago, so I would be included in that 48%. But it is still a self-reporting number, so there isn't a lot of scrutiny as to whether these are numbers that are coming from the kind of like medical professionals, from emergency rooms, but this seems to just be people reporting that they are trans and they've either thought about suicide or have attempted it. They're not the most reliable numbers in the world to get a proper picture of what's going on. But the author also suggests that the government has blood on its hands because they're not giving in to the demands of the activists, or at least it doesn't appear that they are. Again, we don't know the findings, and they're probably not going to be announced for a couple of weeks, so people are preemptively believing that this is automatically going to discriminate against them. And when you make accusations like this, it looks like you're just a trans version of Kevin the teenager. You're throwing a tantrum because you're not getting your way. And really, it's hard to say that you're really discriminated against when you have institutions who are listening to you. You have the likes of Stonewall. You have woke corporations who are always trying to push the trans rights narrative. Hell, this is published in a major news outlet in the UK. So you can't claim that you don't have a voice here. They're happy to run with a headline saying that state-sponsored violence is okay against trans people. Like, that is incredible. And it feeds into this further narrative that really seems to be developing that trans people are some sort of underclass. And this is never questioned. And this doesn't just happen in the UK, of course. I mean, a lot of you have probably seen the hysteria regarding claims that Donald Trump was rolling back protections for trans people in healthcare, meaning health providers could deny life-saving treatment to trans people on the basis of their gender. But As Blair White pointed out in an article in the Post Millennial, that's not the case. She said the transgender protection that everyone is hysterical about being revoked was ruled against in court before Trump was even president. It was never law. Therefore, it was impossible for the Trump administration to revoke it. The mandate was struck down in 2016 before Trump was inaugurated, which means Obama was still president. In December of 2016, Judge Reed O'Connor in Texas, appointed by George W. Bush, riled against the mandate, saying the following: "The rule defines sex bias to include discrimination on the bias's gender identity and termination of pregnancy. The mandate was attempted again in 2019 and overruled by another federal judge. And in fact, as the director of the Office of Civil Rights, Roger Cerevino, puts it, transgender people are already protected by various statutes that prevent discrimination in healthcare." Now, all of this is confirmed on the US Department of Health and Human Services website, which clarifies this. HHS has not been able to enforce these provisions since December 2016, and the provisions have been vacated since October 2019. Now, like the Gender Recognition Act debate in the UK, nothing has actually changed at all, and yet the narrative doesn't reflect this reality. Instead, we're being told that we are under attack, and there's a real scary takeaway from this. Currently, we're living in the best period in history for trans people. In the UK, trans people are free from discrimination in the workplace, for example, something which has now also been instated in America. And the culture is so safe that big businesses are able to virtue signal over it. Now, no matter how cynical it is, and it really, really is, that suggests to me that there is a level of acceptance for trans people that has never been seen before. Hell, even in the much hated Times article, it mentions voters are generally sympathetic to trans rights. The only caveat really is they don't think people with penises should be in women's changing rooms, which isn't really the most controversial position one can think of. But instead of all the kind of good news that you could be thinking, we're being fed a narrative that actually, despite the comforts we now have, and that there are no more rights to be fought for, that the status quo is intrinsically dangerous to us. People hate us, apparently, and the government wants nothing more than for us to be dead. But we should be questioning this viewpoint of inherent victimhood and why this is being accepted so readily. Reality just doesn't reflect this. So who profits from it? I mean, is it pressure groups who rely on oppression being a thing so they can make money out of it? Or the activists who make their trans identity their personality? Can they function if there's no more oppression in the world, or will they find something else to fit their narratives? Pushing the idea of constant threat on a group which you're already saying is quite isolated, and you're really wanting to make them isolated by the way, it really just enforces this view that trans people are some sort of bizarre underclass that are constantly trodden down. And this creates more problems than just angry people on Twitter yelling about TERFs or the cis or whoever else you want to complain about. It creates stress and it creates mistrust amongst the general population. It makes people think that they're actually going to go outside and get assaulted, that the government is actually going to be taking away their rights, that their lives are going to be made inherently more difficult, and that everyone is going to be hateful towards them. And of course, if you buy into all of this, that's an incredibly stressful mindset to have, because you think that you're going to be a victim. You're being told that by people who should really know better. What's more, this is coming out from people who are very quick to parrot the trans suicide statistics. They're building into the same kind of atmosphere, the one in which you're being told that you are an underclass, that you are under threat constantly, and you're saying all this, which isn't true, to a population that you know, or you're telling us, is at high risk of suicide. How do you think that's going to be taken? It seems grossly irresponsible. We're living in one of the most accepting societies for trans people right now. Now, that does not mean this is perfect, not by a long shot, but making the problems seem way worse than they are really isn't going to help the cause. In fact, it's only going to do further damage, and it's going to cause further otherings of trans people, and it's going to further the idea that there is a transgender underclass. We really need to start standing up to this dangerous rhetoric, because it's only a matter of time before this gets more extreme than it already is. So what do you think of this video? I know it's kind of like a trans stupid because I'm touching on current events, but there was more around it that I wanted to say. So please let me know in the comments. Just to give everyone a bit of a heads up, I've recently started using a new social media site called Parler, which is kind of like a free speech Twitter. It's so funny, it actually seems pretty good. A lot of prominent conservatives have moved over there, so it seems at least better than Gab for the time being, but we're yet to see, but still give it a try. Otherwise, you can still follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and if you like what I do, please support me on Patreon and Subscribestar. Thank you all once again, and I'll see you all next time. And a special thank you to Alex Meadows, Alyssa Morris, Aurora T. Silver, Katie Adolphson, Dan Norman, Ada Meadows, Vanilla Cooney, James C. George, James UK, Janine Karen, Jess, Joe, Kim Vandry, Latin Creature, Moy Felicita, Nova B, Rezi, Ricardo Jose, Steve Hendricks, Tennessee Barfly, The Poor of Rizzo, Zoe, Stefan Hansen, Laisha, and all of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. Finally, just to let you all know, there are going to be some new benefits being added for my Patreon supporters soon, so please keep an eye out. Thank you.